Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 40 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Happy 40th, Gavin.
Yeah, happy 40th. I feel like that's some kind of special birthday. I was honestly not all that old when my parents turned 40, so it's like I don't really remember their 40th birthdays if there was anything special. I know 50 is the big one, which we'll get to, in like November probably sometime. But
Something like that in a few months. I was quite young when my mother turned 40, and all I'm roughly aware of is that there was a bunch of people at my house for a party. And I've since found out as I'm getting older that it was a surprise party for my mother that hates surprises. And my dad paid for that one for months, is what I was told. But
I'm sure.
I was probably 5 or 6.
Yeah.
But so yeah, this is number 40 for us.
Mm-hmm. But really quickly, before we get into any of the actual content for this episode, I want to plug something not at all affiliated with us, but something that's just a really great resource for anybody interested in paleontology. There is a wonderful paleontologist by the name of Thomas Holtz, who is, I believe, at the University of Maryland. And he, I believe, I don't know if it's every fall or every other fall, but every so often, he teaches basically like a Dinosaurs 101 course. Because that's what he studies. Is he's one of the good dinosaur researchers that I actually enjoy. But he records all of his lectures and makes them just freely available on YouTube, which is excellent. I really wish that more people would do this. And it's mostly, I think it's honestly more on the institution allowing it than it is the professor actually doing it. I'm sure there are some professors who wouldn't be bothered even if the institution was cool with it. But
right.
Most institutions probably aren't a huge fan of people learning from their professors without them getting some kind of money out of it. Yeah. So props both to Dr. Holtz and the University of Maryland for allowing it. But so we'll have a link to that in the show notes. There's a whole YouTube playlist that I believe has 4 or 5 of his lectures that he's done so far. And he'll continue to add them throughout the semester.
Is there any, are we going to be turning any of these lectures into episodes on their own, or is it not that kind of a thing?
I mean, I haven't watched through them myself. I've listened to a lot of, and read a lot of his, his papers and things in the past, sort of just for fun in my own time, because I'm a nerd. So I know that he does good work. I haven't listened to any of these particular videos in this playlist that I'll be linking. But I'll be doing that sort of soon. And if something strikes me from something that he says in his lectures, we'll definitely go from there. But
awesome. Well, that sounds great. And that'll be the first link in the show notes, followed by our usual quad links that come after that, where you can follow us on Twitter, suggest a topic, all that good stuff.
Yeah,
it'll all be in the show notes. So before we get into today's topic, do we have anything on the calendar? We
sure do. So
see if I can go 2 for 2.
After last week's success, do you have another correct guess?
So I have tied my record for going 1 in a row. I'm going to go 2011.
Sorry.
Not even close.
It is 2016 again.
No, really? Okay.
It is.
Should have stuck with that one.
So the only reason I picked this one, because there's one later within this week in science that has a much more interesting to me, just be what, how, sort of headline. That one is invisibility cloak invented, and just me as a Harry Potter loser nerd that I am. We do not endorse J.K. Rowling on this podcast. It is my own personal headcanon that Daniel Radcliffe wrote the Harry Potter series, but that's neither here nor there. But I just see invisibility cloak and I'm like, what? Excuse me? But the one that we're actually going with is from Wednesday, so the day that this goes out, September 15th, 2016. The headline is, Rattlesnake ancestors had an arsenal of venoms.
An arsenal of venoms. What do they mean by that? What does arsenal mean?
We will find out.
Okay.
So, biologists from the University of Wisconsin-Madison published a study documenting the genetic history of the common rattlesnake. I really wish they'd give a species for that, because I'm not myself familiar with any species called the common rattlesnake. Can you do a quick Google on that for me, Mike?
Common rattlesnake. I can make that happen.
And I will continue. So, according to their research, the ancestors of these snakes were not limited to a single venom, but instead they had access to several toxins that individually targeted the blood, muscle, or nervous systems of bite victims. Though this capacity was lost millions of years ago, the findings shed light on the way in which genetic specificity evolves over time.
So according to Britannica, I guess the
Okay.
most common species is the timber rattlesnake in the
Okay.
eastern United States.
Yes.
Um,
So
yeah,
yeah,
so I guess that's what we're going. Yeah.
I've never heard it called that because we actually technically have there are timber rattlesnakes that live in New York.
Really?
Fun fact, when I lived in South Dakota, it actually kind of blew my mind that there are more species of rattlesnake that live in New York than there are that live in South Dakota, which was weird.
I would not have guessed that.
They're just much more common in South Dakota. But yeah, there's the timber rattlesnake, the Mississauga rattlesnake, and actually, I guess those are the only two rattlesnakes. But there's also technically copperheads in New York as well. Whereas in South Dakota, there's only a single species of venomous snake, and that is the prairie rattlesnake. Anywho, I've never heard timber rattlesnakes called common rattlesnakes, which is why I really wish that this calendar, and I'm positive, obviously, that they specified what animal they were using in the study. Otherwise, they're just not good scientists.
Right, it's like, did the calendar run out of ink here? Like, they could have just said what species it was.
Right, and it's like there's still a substantial portion of this calendar page that's like empty at the bottom of the paragraph. But anywho, we always have to critique the calendar somehow. But
as is tradition.
This isn't inherently surprising to me that they had sort of a mixture of toxins, because it's not like, so venom is actually a really complex mixture of toxins. So it's not like, each species has a different combination of different toxins, but it's not like each species has a single toxin that's unique to it, which is sort of how this makes sound. Venom, regardless if it's from a spider or a snake or even like a jellyfish or something, is very complex. And so this isn't inherently surprising, but again, they just probably kind of word it not the best, because it sort of implies that rattlesnakes have a relatively simple venom. And like I don't know how complex it is relative to like cobra venom or like scorpion venom or something like that. But to imply that it's simple is probably just not that accurate, because like I said, venom is just, it's a cocktail is how it's commonly referred. It's a whole mixture of a bunch of different proteins.
So once again, the calendar has teased us and then let us down.
Pretty much. Hopefully, unlike this episode, which I think is going to be really fun. So I asked Mike as soon as we started this call how familiar he was with the concept of cryptozoology.
And this is one of the few things that like I have heard of, and I have a very, very small amount of experience with when I first heard of this. So just as a quick background, apparently Gavin's girlfriend's mother was listening to the show and said that our most recent episode was a little complex, which I would agree with that. It was a high level episode, and we needed something that was a little bit more, let's just say, on my level for this episode. And so this is what Gavin prepared for us, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, so it's not just about cryptozoology and some of the various quirks that go along with that, but also how it relates to paleontology specifically, because there are many different ways to sort of approach the concept of cryptozoology. But seeing as this is a mainly paleontology-focused podcast, we're going to come at it from that angle. It's actually funny. So I've actually seen cryptozoology actually been proposed as... Actually, let's talk about what cryptozoology is first.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, I don't want to assume that people just know what it means. So, cryptozoology is generally a pretty broad term that can kind of range from anything from like amateur scientists just kind of going out and having a good time to very like bro or like frat culture-y pseudoscience. And that's sort of like the main two camps that there kind of are in cryptozoology. But let's go over some actual definitions. So according to the International Cryptozoology Museum
That should be good.
in Portland, Maine, it is the study of hidden or unknown animals, typically large species. This would be things like your Bigfoot, your Loch Ness Monster, things of that nature.
Things that notoriously don't exist.
Yes, depending on who you ask, apparently.
Well,
So,
yes.
so that is the definition that the International Cryptozoology Museum itself uses. The definition from Wikipedia calls it a pseudoscience or subculture that aims to prove the existence of entities from the folklore record. You know, animals and creatures that are not known to science, but are known to regions, known to people living in a specific area.
The kinds of things that show up in like children's TV shows and, the History Channel.
Yes, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, so both of those kind of hit the opposite, like the, I guess, ends of the spectrum, where like the International Cryptozoology Museum probably wants to portray it in sort of the best light, whereas the Wikipedia straight up calls it a pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is the definition from Merriam-Webster, is sort of hits that middle ground, where it's the study of and search for animals, and especially legendary animals, in parentheses, such as Sasquatch, usually in order to evaluate the possibility of their existence.
What was the last part of that? Usually to do what with their existence?
To evaluate the possibility,
I think,
of their existence.
That's a very interesting word, evaluate.
Mm-hmm. And I think that might be a little generous, if I'm being honest.
I would have to say, because it seems like with a lot of what I'm familiar with cryptozoology, and imagine if you're the listener, imagine you are somebody that is getting into this, or you are somebody that's really into cryptozoology, and you
right.
are, let's say, evaluating Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. You could approach it in one of two ways. You could approach it, with the scientific method, not coming in with any, preconditions, and just trying to evaluate the data, where they may lie.
Mm-hmm.
Or you could go there trying to prove the Loch Ness Monster exists, or trying to find evidence of Bigfoot existing. And if you're going to imagine the kind of people that are going through, in participating in cryptozoology, you can imagine that it's a lot more of the latter and not the former that are kind of going into this field. So I think evaluate's a very neutral term that maybe isn't quite warranted here.
And we will talk about that, because some things that sort of technically fall under the umbrella of cryptozoology do follow the scientific method and do, what I would consider is good science. However, some of it is definitely pseudoscience. So since one of the definitions used that, and since we just sort of talked about it, let's talk about pseudoscience, itself, especially because there's been, sadly, much too much of it going on in the last 18 months or so. So, pseudoscience, the best definition that I was sort of able to find for it is not like pretending, pseudoscience literally means fake science. However, that's not entirely accurate, but I can't think of a better term to use instead. But it's basically using scientific words and using scientific sounding terms in like an authoritative way without actually following the scientific method.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, as I think about this, it's kind of one of those things, like you said, using scientific terms and having that veneer of authenticity. And you can even just straight up tell people, yeah, you can go, check the paper yourselves or do your own research. And when you say that kind of thing, do your own research, that gives a lot of people the idea, well, if they're just saying do your own research, well, that clearly these guys did their research. Clearly,
right.
This person that's talking to me knows what they're talking about. I don't need to investigate that much further. And so it's definitely like that, as you meant, like that veneer of authenticity, that sounding scientific. They're probably wearing lab coats, and they might have one guy that got their PhD from, nowhere university. And
in like nutraceutical science or something like that.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
naturopathic medicine.
Of course.
So that is what a lot of people see cryptozoology as, where, cryptozoology, things that end in ology generally sound scientific. And I think it's a cool word because, zoology means the study of animals. Crypto means hidden or secret. That is sort of the traditional, like, I think that's actually Greek. Like what that root comes from. So it's the study of hidden animals, which is, depending on who you ask, actually pretty apt. And so this is a really interesting sort of intersection between some areas of this that are kind of sciencey and then areas that are definitely not. And a big part of why they are not is because they are convinced that this animal exists. However, they are going out to find the evidence that it exists, which is the complete
Right.
opposite of the actual scientific method. Because the scientific method is very circular. You start out with an observation, you create a hypothesis to test, a question about that observation. How did this, event occur? We see this, layer of rocks that looks different than the rest. Why is it like that? You run some tests. That might be chemical tests. That might be, grain size analysis, different kinds of geological tests that you can run. And then you evaluate your hypothesis based on the results of the test. And then you make new observations based on the data that you collected and create a new hypothesis. And it's very circular. However, with things like cryptozoology, as some people do it, they start off at the I have the before the observation step in the loop, essentially. So they put the cart before the horse, essentially.
Yes.
They're at their conclusion and they're looking for evidence to support it instead of finding evidence that you then make a conclusion off of. And the reason that I also want to do this, because I thought about maybe waiting to do this episode around like Halloween, sort of spooky times. But then I kind of remembered, I kind of remembered as this idea kind of popped in my head, how much of a personal connection that I had with cryptozoology as a kid.
Really?
Yeah. So
I did not know this. Okay.
So if you were a fan of, I believe, I don't honestly remember if it was on the History Channel or if it was on National Geographic. I'm inclined to say National Geographic. But there was a show that I actually looked up that ran from 2007 to 2010 called Monster Quest. It was a wonderful show
right. More Google
that I loved at the time. That was very mockumentary-esque and something that I definitely would hate nowadays because it reminds me, everything that I've read about it in doing some of the research for this episode, reminds me a lot of the Megalodon stuff that I kind of ranted about during Shark Week, where it doesn't...
History Channel, by the way.
History Channel. Okay, thank you. It doesn't come right out and say, hey, this is probably all fake. And at least that's partially because the people that are featured in each episode probably do believe in what they're saying. They're just pseudoscientists.
Yeah.
So, like, to those people, it is real, unlike the Megalodon stuff where it's like they know that it's fake. They're just doing it for entertainment. These at least had some kind of veneer of reality. But I love that show.
The people that are doing it are true believers.
Yes. Yeah. I loved that show as a kid, and it honestly influenced me a lot. And I actually, I don't remember if it was 7th or 8th grade, like home economics class. I don't remember what the context of the project or something was, but we were to write a letter to our future selves, that sort of shtick. And apparently at the time, I was very into cryptozoology because in that letter, I wrote to myself, I don't even remember when they got back to me, whether it was like after senior year or a couple of years after senior year. But in the letter, I wrote to myself that I wanted to be a cryptozoologist. So like this was something that I was interested in enough to want to potentially make a career out of it when I was like 13. Um, but yeah, so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a kid. But
Yes, clearly.
so what kind of things are we talking about here? We've sort of gone over a few of the more famous ones, and we'll definitely go more in depth on uh, some of the more famous ones in a bit. But the term cryptid, which is sort of the catch-all term for these animals or creatures that are spoken of in these myths and legends and things that cryptozoologists try to find. So what sort of cryptids can you sort of name off the top of your head?
Cryptid. So these are like the kinds of things that they're trying to find.
Yes.
So when we talked about Bigfoot,
Mm-hmm.
Are Bigfoot and Sasquatch the same thing?
Yeah, they're more or less like there's like regional differences. Nearly every region has some kind of legend about a giant ape
No, of course they do.
human thing. So like there's Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti. I
Yeti.
believe in Florida there's one called the skunk ape. I think in
Of course, in
Australia
Florida, of
they
course.
have In Australia I think they have a legend that's called the bunyip. I think is the name of that one. But most regions have some kind of folklore about some kind of large human-like ape thing.
Okay, so we'll lump all those together under like the Bigfoot category.
Yep.
Loch Ness monster.
Yep, that's a really classic one that we'll break down in a bit.
Yep. New Jersey Devil.
Ooh, that's a good one that I hadn't thought about. But yeah, that's also a really good one. That's one that's okay, weirdly super popular in Japan for some reason.
Is it okay?
Yeah, I don't know
Okay.
why. And the only reason that I know that is because one of my favorite Pokemon is based off of it. But yeah, so the New Jersey Devil is something that was like from like only like a single or maybe two police reports that happened in somewhere in New Jersey, but some kind
Really?
of alien like creature. And I don't know like what it did to warrant somebody writing a police report about it or something, but I just know that it became very popular in Japan. um,
Oh goodness, what else? I'm trying to think if there's anything else. And I'm coming up with like mermaids and stuff, which I think might
mhm.
even be stretching for
No,
cryptozoology.
that usually that falls in this category pretty
Does okay?
broadly. Um, but
Yeah, I'm
the
kind of at my limit. What else?
mhm.
What are some other big ones?
Those are the main ones that probably most people think of. One that
Right.
I sort of hear about a lot is you hear about a handful of dinosaurs or dinosaur-like animals living in like the jungles of Africa, um,
Hmm.
as well, which we'll break down again, similar to the Loch Ness monster in a little bit here. Um, but something that I wanted to point out with cryptids is that it is usually that's what people think of is things like Bigfoot, things like Loch Ness monster, but it also sort of broadly includes weird versions of otherwise normal animals. So, for example,
Oh, like are we talking like hybrid stuff, like human whatever hybrids?
potentially that's a little more science fictiony.
Okay.
But this would be things like, for example, I lived in South Dakota for 2 years. The symbol of the jackalope is pretty much everywhere out there. If you're unfamiliar, the jackalope is just
Jackalope.
a jackrabbit with like the horns or antlers of like a deer or something.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'm not gonna lie. Like if you just said jackalope to me, I probably wouldn't even realize that wasn't a real thing, and I probably just would have like thought like I just like it.
Hmm.
It I'm sure that I knew that at some point, but yeah, I was like, yeah,
Hmm.
jackalope. I know what that is.
Right. And that also sort of falls in the category of just like really large, like particularly unusually giant individuals of certain things, like giant snakes, giant crocodiles, you
Okay.
know, um, generally fall sort of in the umbrella of cryptozoology as well. Because, you know, I'm sure down in Florida, everybody and their brother thinks that, like, oh, they've seen 20-25 foot alligator, and it's like, no, you haven't.
Right. You probably thought you did. Like, I don't
You're
think you're
right, right,
lying. I think you're just wrong.
right, exactly. Like I believe that you believe that, but that's factually not true.
Right.
So things like that also broadly fall in the terms of cryptozoology, although much less sort of sinister, I guess, or pseudoscience-y, because like,
Okay.
would it be absolutely impossible to find a giant alligator? No, but by giant, I mean like
Hmm.
15 feet is like the usual like max for like at least American alligators. Some like saltwater crocodiles, now crocodiles do get a bit bigger than that, but
Right. It's
um
it's one of those, like, there's gradations with all of this stuff. Like,
yeah, for
if
sure.
if the Loch Ness monster was discovered, that would upend kind of everything that you correct me if I'm wrong. That would sort of upend everything we know about the biology of that region. Versus if we found a 20-foot gator, like, that would be wild, but like that could be fit into what is currently understood without too much modification.
That would mostly be like, okay, this alligator has a crazy pituitary gland problem or something.
Right, like,
Just
it could
just
be
in the same case,
explained.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas there's actually been studies, not recently, but that got published in like Nature. So like one of the like preeminent, one of the highest class, science journals in the world, about like the ecological requirements that would be needed to support an animal like the Loch Ness monster in Loch Ness.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, this is just not a thing.
Hmm.
It would need way too much food. It would be way too large. This is just not something that is
Right.
ecologically possible as we understand currently. Um, and that is generally the case with a lot of the more traditional cryptids, things like Bigfoot. Um, but something that is sort of talked about with cryptozoologists a lot is, well, there's been all sorts of animals that we didn't know about for a long time, and then we found them. They turned out to be real.
This was going to be one of my questions.
Hmm.
Like, is there anything that has gone from cryptozoology, things that were laughed at by the scientific establishment, and then like was discovered and went from being a pseudoscience to something that was commonly understood? Or has that never happened? Is there different processes that goes through? Like, what has there been any success stories from cryptozoology, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Modern cryptozoology, not really. There's one case that I'll talk about,
Okay.
um, but the one that cryptozoologists point to a lot is an animal called the okapi.
Okay.
So the okapi is the closest living relative to giraffes. It doesn't look super like a giraffe. Its neck is much shorter. It's got much shorter legs in general, and it's very brown. Its coat doesn't really have like the sort of spotted pattern that a giraffe does, but on its
Okay.
back legs, it has black and white stripes like a zebra.
Hmm.
So, and it lives in like the super super dense forest of Central Africa in the Congo rainforest. So, an area that is not particularly well explored, even still to today, other than by like native peoples. And so, European sort of explorers and colonizers got there in sort of the a lot of the records that I found were from like the late 1880s or so.
Hmm.
Um, and they'd been sort of told about this animal, uh, but they hadn't been able to find one. And then eventually they found they were brought the native peoples were like, oh no, there's this animal out here that you know I don't know how it came up, but it just sort of came up in conversation. Maybe they were like, okay, we want to see all of the animals here. What animals have we not seen yet? With as you as our guide.
Right.
Um, and so they're very elusive animals. They don't like people. Good for them. Uh, Humans have a bad habit of killing large animals,
Oh, do we? Is that a thing we do?
Very frequently. Yeah, we like to kill all of the large, especially hooved animals that won't kill us back. But yeah, so they eventually were brought a skull, and they're like, okay, so it's a weird giraffe, based on its skull. And I think that they had been brought most of those things in like 1901 or so, and it was formally named later that year in 1901. So they'd been sort of told about it
Okay.
for a decent amount of time beforehand, and then it was like formally published and named, like given a scientific name in 1901. So that is sort of the main one that
And that's
is
from more than a century ago.
exactly. Another that is actually sort of the mascot of that International Cryptozoology Museum that I mentioned earlier. Their sort of mascot is the coelacanth, which we've talked about before.
Right.
So the coelacanth is sort of the quintessential quote unquote living fossil, which, as we talked about, is a term that I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
But and it's sort of the reason why cryptozoologists really talk about the coelacanth a lot is because this animal, like, just kind of evaded the fossil record for 66 million years,
Mm-hmm.
And so they're like, well, if this could do it, why can't other things? Which is a really bad. I need to brush up on like the different kinds of logical fallacies, but I'm sure
Yes.
that's one of them.
Yeah, right. That had to be somewhere. Logical fallacies is just one of my favorite things to look at. It's like, oh, I should be making this argument better myself.
Right, exactly. And the coelacanth has a lot of really special things about it that helped it evade the fossil record. Number one, it's the fossil record. It's inherently not great.
Right.
Number two is that they are fish. A lot of other, cryptids, things like Bigfoot, have big, robust bones. They're big bodied animals.
Right.
Big bodied animals leave big bones. Big bones are easier to find and are just much more likely to be preserved to begin with. There's a reason why you find way more like, whole elephant bones than you do whole mice bones.
Yeah.
Mice are just, their bones are way more fragile because they're so much smaller, and fish have very small bones.
That
And oh,
that
go
all
ahead.
checks out.
And then lastly, especially with coelacanths in particular, where they live is not good for producing fossils. They live in a really, really deep ocean, mostly on seamounts, like on underwater mountains, essentially. They live along the cliffs. And so those things have really helped coelacanths stay hidden. At least this particular lineage of coelacanths. Not all coelacanths are like that, but this particular lineage is. And
Okay.
and some other things that also help them or help cryptozoologists sort of latch onto them is that we actually knew about coelacanths from fossils before we knew that they were still alive.
Really?
Yeah, so the genus Coelacanthus
Wow.
is a fossil genus that was named, I think like exactly 100 years. I think it was, yeah, like 1839 or thereabout.
Mm-hmm.
And the modern living coelacanths were found, at least the first one that was found in 1938. So it's been less than 100 years since we've known about this one. And then the Indonesian species of coelacanth we just found in 1999. So it's like,
Wow.
well, we just found out about it, and these are not small fish either. Coelacanth can be like 6 feet long, so like they're not small fish. So I understand why cryptozoologists latch on to them, but it's like either you don't understand how fossils work, or you do and you don't care.
Yeah. Right. Again, this goes back to using something to push an agenda instead of,
Exactly.
following the facts where they may lie.
Mm-hmm. And there are some relatively recent, although with some asterisks, examples of finding new species. So one, there is a new species of tapir named from Central America. So tapir are rhino relatives. They're essentially like, if you've ever seen something that looks like a pig but with like a little tiny elephant trunk, that's a tapir.
Okay.
So a new species was named in 2013 from South America. And these are not small animals. They can be, several hundred pounds.
Wow.
And this one in particular was a case of, native peoples in the area being like, no, there's a different kind here that we know about. We are aware of our local animals. And scientists finally, sort of recognized it as another species. And then similarly, a new species of peccary, which are close pig relatives. Pigs are only from the old world, though. If they're from native to the Americas, they're peccaries, different families. It's taxonomy. It's weird, whatever. But it's called the Giant Peccary, and that was named in 2007, also from Central America or South America. However, these are cases of people sort of quibbling over taxonomy, where it's like some people are like, no, this is just a weird population of this species that we already know. The people who obviously published the papers were like, no, we have evidence to suggest that it's its own species. And it's like, okay, so we knew that they were there. They just might be slightly different than the ones that are around them. So it's not like, hey, we have tapirs here. Oh, here's this, extinct giant tapir that we haven't seen in 30 million years. That's not what's going on here. It's just very closely related things that there might technically be a difference between. Again, these are things that cryptozoologists latch onto, where it's like we just found a new tapir. Stories. Yes. And that's kind of something that if I were to meet somebody who's, spends a decent amount of time doing cryptozoology, I'm like, does that count as cryptozoology? Like those scientists who went out, and especially with the tapir, because like I said, they talked to native people who were like, no, there's a different kind here. I would argue that probably counts, right? Because that's the main thing with cryptozoology, is that it's dealing with, creatures from folklore. And a term that's actually kind of thrown around a decent amount with cryptozoology is called ethno-known. Known through, the folklore or just like stories of a particular region.
Yeah, I guess it definitely, it feels a little bit off, but yeah, if something was unknown to, science, but was kind of passed down through oral tradition, and then, people discovered it, I guess that falls under at least some amount of cryptozoology, and then comes out of cryptozoology and just becomes part of, science.
Right. So that's kind of what I would call like the good side of cryptozoology. And by that, I mean actually going and communicating with native peoples about their own wildlife, because obviously they would know it better.
Right.
Then, obviously like native peoples in South America would know their local wildlife better than some researcher from North America. No matter how much they study the area, the natives are just going to know it better.
Right.
Full stop. And so that's a really interesting way of potentially finding new animals that, granted, I don't know how often used that kind of approach is. But obviously communicating more with native peoples instead of just going there and taking their stuff is probably good.
Generally.
So, and potentially using that as well as a sort of excuse for like preserving some like native, especially forest habitats, because we're doing a real good job of destroying those real fast.
Sarcasm noted.
Yeah. So that's like I said, sort of the good side of cryptozoology. So let's sort of move on to maybe the not so good side. And that's conveniently the fun side, which we will come back to at the end. And this is conveniently where paleontology kind of comes into it. So paleontology is really often sort of brought into cryptozoology because many people who are like in the, I keep wanting to say like crypto community, but I feel like that's going to refer to like cryptocurrency.
Yeah, there's going to be a term for that.
But in the cryptozoology community, they often use the fossil record sort of as an excuse, or like to find ways in which their creature of choice could exist today. And it's kind of painfully convenient for cryptozoologists that the fossil record is sometimes not good. Because it's like, if coelacanths could do it, like I said, if coelacanths could do it, why can't Bigfoot be some giant ape thing that we just never got the good fossils of? And to that I say, I have no way of proving that that's not true.
It's hard to prove a negative.
But that's exactly, but that's not how science works. It comes back to the whole, is this like a straw man logical fallacy, I think is what this one is, where it's like, statement, prove me wrong.
I mean, it's I don't know if that's quite a straw man is like, building up a caricature of
Okay.
so it'd be like, you say, what are you saying, that it's impossible to discover other species? And it's like,
Okay.
well, no, it's not what we're saying. I think
And I
this
just want to be
reminds me.
clear, new species are discovered all the time,
Absolutely.
constantly. And that's why I sort of specified that from the International Cryptozoology Museum that they even specify on their website that it's typically large species, because new beetles and things, are published multiple new species of beetle like every day, or even things like new frogs from like Central and South America or Central Africa, literally all the time.
Yeah, I mean, what I would attribute that more to, and this isn't a perfect fit, but are you familiar with Christopher Hitchens?
Is that the guy sitting behind the little desk table in a park meme?
No, no,
Okay,
like
then no, I am
the
not.
change my mind guy.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Of.
very, very different guy. That's Steven
Okay.
Crowder.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense.
Very different. Christopher Hitchens. He's long dead. He had he said something. I shouldn't say long dead. It was probably been a decade or so now.
Okay.
He had something that's kind of been put into kind of a logical eraser. Basically said, anything that if you are asserting something that is kind of grand, that would really change things, the burden of proof is on you to prove that. The burden of proof is not on somebody else to prove that wrong.
Is he
extraordinary
the
claims?
Yes.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is basically
Right.
the genesis of it, and it's not on somebody else to prove it wrong.
Exactly, and that's just a general piece of advice that I think most people could take, where it's like, you can't just make
Yes.
you can't just make a claim and then not be able to back it up.
Well, you can, but it's
Well, you
bad.
can, but you're not good, and for some reason, that is an argument that wins far too often in our political discourse. Anyway, moving on. But there are lots of cryptids that are discussed in terms of being sort of relics or like holdovers from, fossil groups that are real, or at least were real, that it lived at some time, and that these cryptids are just sort of a leftover member of that group that escaped the fossil records, similar to how coelacanths did. And so some of them are fairly obvious. Very commonly, Plesiosaurus, which we've talked about a whole bunch. We will do an episode on them specifically eventually. But these are your long-necked, ocean-dwelling reptiles from the time of the dinosaurs. They look, in fact, I often describe them whenever I talk about them on the podcast, like the Loch Ness Monster. They have the sort of almost sea turtle-like body, very sort of, stomach to back flattened, rounded with flippers, and then a long snaky neck. They have been co-opted not just for the Loch Ness Monster, but for sea monsters of every variety since they were discovered in sort of the early 1800s or so. So they've sort of been scapegoated throughout, the last couple hundred years as sea monster of your choice.
Right.
We have another extinct group of reptiles, dinosaurs in general, sort of like we talked about in Africa, which we'll break down a little further in a little bit here. But there's always been, as basically once, the Europe started really getting into like the interior of Africa and doing all of their colonial things in there.
Right.
All sorts of legends about ancient animals existing in this primitive land, and all sorts of other tropes and things like that. Obviously, dinosaurs, paleontology, so I hear about these quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one that actually I hate that I actually like is Gigantopithecus, which is the largest ape that we've ever found in the fossil record.
Okay.
This is a group that many people are like, oh, Bigfoot evolved from is either Gigantopithecus or something that is descended from Gigantopithecus. And there are many reasons that this is definitely not true. But and I hate myself that I kind of like it because it's recent. We don't have great Gigantopithecus fossils, but they went extinct potentially as short ago as like 100,000 years.
Okay.
Most things that I saw said closer to like 300,000, but still, that's not long ago. So just because our last fossils might have been from that long ago, that's a really short amount of time.
Right.
For something, just because we don't have fossils there, that's only 300,000 years. It's not unreasonable for something to escape the fossil record for 300,000 years. That's nothing. However, there's, again, I'll break this down in a bit, but those are sort of just some of the animals that are co-opted into various cryptids and folklore, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, just giant X creature of your choosing. Just because things being giant is sort of a trope of how we used to sort of think about like the fossil record, where it's like, yes, like giant snakes did exist in the past, giant crocodiles did exist in the past, but not everything was always giant. in the fossil record, we have real small snakes and we have real small crocodilians, just like we do today.
Right.
So yeah, so that's also some potential thoughts as to like, I saw this 40-foot snake. It might be Titanoboa, which is an actual name for a snake. It's a genus of snake from like 50 million years ago or so. But
okay.
Yeah. But no, you didn't see a 40-foot snake. Anyway.
No, nothing.
And this also includes Megalodon, which we talked about at length in our discussion about Shark Week. And something I think is really telling, especially about some of the more reptilian-based cryptids, is that they tend to fall into the old stereotypes of how we used to think these animals worked. Like the old-timey view of how we viewed dinosaurs, how we viewed plesiosaurs. So while our scientific understanding of these groups has changed and been updated, the cryptozoological view of the cryptids that are most likely based off of these animals has not. And that is particularly why with like the Loch Ness Monster, you see it with a really long upright neck sticking straight up out of the water, when nowadays we know that plesiosaurs almost certainly could not do that. But that was how they were depicted for a long time, a long time of their history. And some really interesting things kind of go along with both the Loch Ness Monster and some of the dinosaur-like things in Africa. So with the Loch Ness Monster, the first sighting of Nessie was in 1933. Not all that long ago, right?
I mean, not in the grand scheme of things. Like if we're talking about folklore and whatnot, I'd expect it to be, there's multiple stories going back to, ancient blah, blah, blah,
Right. People have been living along Loch Ness
I was going
for
to say, like, I could go find
hundreds, thousands of years.
Yeah. Long.
Yeah. Conveniently, there's a little known movie, you might have heard of it, that came out in 1933 called King Kong. in
I'm
which
familiar.
there's a scene that features King Kong fighting something suspiciously like a plesiosaur. It lives in the water. It's got a really long neck.
Hmm.
Um, and coincidentally, there was also a road built along the loch that sort of increased, sort of, you could see more of the loch at a time, I guess, and
Hmm.
just, let more people drive alongside the loch. But
Right.
sightings in 1933 sort of started off not very descriptive. Just some person, telling like the local paper or something, hey, I saw this weird thing in the loch. And then throughout the year of 1933, which is there's a lot of sightings from 1933.
Of course.
As the year goes on, you can sort of watch it, the reports morph into a more descriptive thing of a plesiosaur shaped animal, presumably as more people saw the movie. Again, correlation is not causation. I'm not going to go for that logical fallacy, but
Right.
it's a little funky that that kind of happened. And then very similar things with, um, like I said, some of those dinosaur esque cryptids from Africa. The most common one that you'll see talked about is called Mokele Mbembe, and it's
Hmm.
mostly known from like the Congo River basin, similar to the area where the okapi was found.
Right.
But it's most commonly depicted as a sauropod like dinosaur. The long necks, long tails, really big bodied dinosaurs.
Right.
Uh, but just like with the plesiosaurs, it's often depicted with its neck held sort of straight vertical, which we
Okay.
know most of them. There are some that could, but still not quite like completely vertical.
Hmm.
More of like a ramp than a skyscraper. But that's how Mokele Mbembe is often depicted, with the
Right.
big skyscraper neck. It's often depicted and talked about with its tail dragging on the ground, which is how we used to think about dinosaurs. And it's often depicted as living in swamps, which is not uncommon for like the area, because it's the Congo River basin. It's very much similar to like the Amazon, and it's a rainforest. There's lots of swamps.
Hmm.
But that's an old trope of particularly sauropod dinosaurs, in that when they were first found, they were like, these animals could not possibly have supported their own weight. They must have lived in water, because they're so big that they just couldn't have been able to support themselves without crushing themselves. We now know today that that's not true.
Hmm.
But, back when these stories about this first, started hitting the mainstream, that was what was sort of talked about. Conveniently, that was when dinosaurs were getting incredibly popular and a lot of media attention
Of
in North
course.
America and Europe
Of
around
course.
around the 1910s. And so, and um, I really hate these ones, because like it really plays on that old trope of Africa being some, you know old primitive backward continent, which obviously is kind of racist and not true.
Just a little bit.
But uh
I don't even blame people for doing it too, because people don't always like know what they're talking about. But like, it's, when you start thinking, it's like, oh yeah, like maybe we should be more careful with what we're talking about.
right. And it's like how this legend in particular is thought to have started, because this is one of the better studied ones in terms of like its origin.
Hmm.
So people have taken, photos of large animals that are just real animals, just not found there, and shown them to, native peoples who have never seen these animals before, like photographs of them. And most often they point to a rhinoceros as what Mokele Mbembe is, or like at least what
Hmm.
it looks most closest to. And so it's kind of thought that either, like thousands of years ago, or, long, long time ago, rhinos used to live in the area, or maybe that particular group of people moved into that area from a place where there were rhinos. And they would just be telling, folklore stories, campfire stories, things like that, or
Right.
oral tradition, which is famously unreliable. um,
That's kind of the
and
point.
yeah, and about rhinos, and then over hundreds, thousands, who knows how many years, it sort of morphed into, something different. That when European and North American researchers got there, they were told these stories, and then because dinosaurs were all the craze at the time, the you know colonizers were like, "That sounds like a dinosaur." That's most likely how this particular one kind of got started.
Right.
And then with things like Bigfoot, that one's very easy to sort of be like, okay, no, that's not Gigantopithecus, because Gigantopithecus is most closely related to orangutans and was definitely a knuckle walker. And you always see Bigfoot, that old like super grainy video of it, very much
Mm-hmm.
walking on two legs. Arms only go down to like, maybe a little bit below the waist.
Which has been disproven 1,000 like that.
Oh, 100%.
I get that, we are dealing with some, shady stuff, but that specific video, y'all know the one
Right.
that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like
The one where
just
it's
look into
walking
it.
and then it turns and looks at the camera. Yeah.
Right.
And there's also been sort of people that have proposed like, oh, it's a different group that is more closely related to humans called the Robust Australopithecines, which are sort of a side group from what our genus Homo evolved from.
Mm-hmm.
And they were bigger boned and bigger bodied, but they were still pretty much human. They were definitely not even close to that big, and we would know if they were still around.
Right.
And it's also not sort of recently, but in the past been proposed that they're just Neanderthals who like reverted back to being more ape-like. And we're like, no, Neanderthals. If you walk down, a busy city street and a Neanderthal in like just regular clothing walked by you, you probably wouldn't notice. Like they're humans.
Yeah. Right.
It's just a different kind of human. So yeah, there's one last bit about cryptids I wanted to touch on, which because this actually kind of popped up in my life recently, which is sort of animals in places where they don't belong. And with people keeping more and more different kinds of animals as pets, this has become less sort of spectacular because it's like, oh, somebody finds a crocodile in New York City. It makes the headlines, but nobody's like, there's a secret population of crocodiles living here in New York City. No, like there's nobody serious that kind of thinks that. But there are some legends and stories that do have a little bit more of like the folklore aspect to them. And there is an actual name for this one, but I didn't write it down, sadly. But there's lots of legends of like a large cat-like kind of animal in Australia, which there really hasn't been other than like introduced just like domestic cats that have since gone feral for a really long time. Especially like with like cat-like proportions. There's been like vaguely cat-like marsupial predators, but they don't really have like the same proportions or like walking structure as a cat.
Really?
So like that's So like they might have the same like superficial shape, but marsupials walk very differently. Their limbs are just structured really differently than like non-marsupial mammals.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, there's and this actually was kind of in the news recently, but they recently recolored some new footage that they found of the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger, which was a real animal that we have footage of the last one that went extinct. It went extinct sometime in I think the 30s, and so they recently found some new footage of that last individual that we had. And they somehow, I don't know how people like recolor black and white footage to give it color, but they did. But people,
A lot of hard work.
Right, yeah, even though it's been extinct for 80 years or so, people still sort of claim every now and then that they see one somewhere in Australia. They've been extinct like on mainland Australia for quite a while.
Oh, really?
Definitely before European settlers got there. but they
Okay.
were still found on the island of Tasmania for until relatively recently. But people still claim that they see them every now and then, and that's something that like the Australian government actually looks into, because
Really?
that becomes like a conservation sort of thing.
Right.
I don't know how seriously they take it, but and then the one that happened to me sort of recently is mountain lions in New York. So I called my parents recently since moving to California,
Right.
and just PSA, talk to your parents more.
Yeah.
So yeah, I called my parents. My dad was like, "Yeah, I was driving home the other day, and it was dark out." Actually, I don't know if he was going to or from work, but whatever. And he was like, "And I saw a mountain lion," and I'm like, "Yeah,
Oh, did you?
did you?" He was like, "Yeah." And like we have bobcats and stuff around our house, but bobcats and stuff don't have like the long tail that most other cats do. And that was the big thing that he said. It's like, yeah, it was big and the tail was really long. But people are, and if my dad ever hears this, sorry. That's why I told him to set up some trail cameras, because I'm like, otherwise I'm probably not going to believe you.
Yeah.
But there is an occasional sighting sort of in the Adirondack Mountains. But
Right.
generally, those are ones that kind of wandered into the state. There's not like a breeding population of mountain lions in the state, even in the Adirondack Mountains. There's really just not.
Mm-hmm.
And again, with humans doing a really good job of killing fairly large sized mammals, we're really good at it.
Right.
And so that sort of rounds out the different sort of aspects of cryptozoology. And I kind of want to end off by saying a few things about like my own view of cryptozoology. And that one, just because I'm kind of dumping on the science, quote unquote, of it, doesn't mean that I don't like it. Like I said, just because it's not good science doesn't mean it's not fun.
Well, of course. I mean, that you can have, these things can all be done, in good fun, and done, in a way that's interesting, or done rigorously, or just done as a hobby. It's, the dark side of the stuff that, you mentioned, that, can really give people some bad ideas.
Right. It's when you try and pass it off as science. And so
Right.
I sort of see cryptozoology in sort of two different ways. The first one is sort of like the poor man's conspiracy theory, where it's like I know it's not true, but I still like the media that kind of surrounds it. Like for example,
Yeah.
I haven't watched it yet, but there is a series on Hulu called Sasquatch, and I actually checked the sort of like Hulu page for it.
Mm-hmm.
There's currently 3 episodes up, and the sort of premise of it is that in Northern California in 1993, some journalist heard a story about it says 3 men on a farm being torn limb from limb by a savage Bigfoot attack. So it's sort of but it's him going back, however many years later, and it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of treated as like a true crime thing, not hey, let's go
Right.
find Bigfoot. Because like the way it's phrased, even in like the description, as let's see, this journalist that heard this story in 1993 said let's see, Sasquatch, the name of the show, follows David as he revisits the redwoods 25 years later in search of any evidence that might lead to the truth of what happened that night.
The
So it's like
truth of what happened.
yes, exactly, and I like the way they phrase that, because they make it ambiguous enough to still make people want to read it, but not being like he's returning 25 years later to go find Bigfoot. That's not how this show is being pitched. Like I said, I've not
Right.
seen the show. I intend to watch it at some point. But that's the kind of like cryptozoology media that I enjoy, particularly if it's something that doesn't take itself too seriously. I really enjoy
Yes.
reading cryptozoology books, and there was even like a cryptozoology TV show on like Cartoon Network when I was a kid.
Was it really?
Yeah, it was called The Secret Saturdays.
Well, I have no memory of this. I watched a lot of Cartoon Network. I do not remember that.
I believe it was Cartoon Network anyway. I don't think it lasted long. But yeah, so that's one of the two ways, and that it's, fun entertainment, as long as it doesn't take itself too seriously, and as long as it makes itself clear that it is entertainment.
Yes.
The other
And
way that
it's
I kind of see it is sort of as a gateway drug into more dangerous anti-science conspiracies, such as things like young earth creationism or anti-vaxxing or flat earthers or things like that, because cryptozoology in and of itself isn't all that dangerous relative to other sort of pseudoscience-y things. You're not hurting anybody by spending a bunch of your own money going and looking for Bigfoot, but you're
however,
but you're spreading that kind of really bad misconceptions about science, because to most people, if you were to show up in some small Northern California town, or small town in Vermont or something, being like, hey, I came here from X other state, I'm a researcher looking for Bigfoot, they will think you're a scientist. They will think you're an official person from some official place looking for Bigfoot, depending
right.
on how you pass yourself off, obviously. But it would not be hard to convince people of that. And
And
then
it's,
that in turn, oh, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say, I mean, this is something that's actually personal for me, because I was when I was younger, I sort of got hit, with the conspiracy bug, and I went down some rabbit holes that I'm certainly not proud of now. And that's part of what I like to do now is like really look into these, the bizarro kind of conspiracies, to figure out like what's pulling people in. And just, it can, like you said, and I see this with some social studies teachers sometimes when they want to talk about conspiracy theories. Let's do a class on conspiracy theories. And I always want to say, like, look at, you can run your class however you want. If you want to talk about JFK, that's usually a pretty safe one.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't take long to go from, I wonder what the truth is, to eventually someone's going to be like, so the Jews. And it's
Yes.
not, that happens faster than people
Yeah.
realize, I think.
No, 100%. Like, literally, it's sort of like that old adage where it's like, if a conversation goes on long enough, it will always end up going back to Hitler.
Godwin's law, absolutely.
I knew it had a name, but I couldn't remember it. It's sort
Godwin's
of
law.
like similar to that, but it's like, no, all conspiracy theories will eventually lead to Jewish people bad, which obviously is not true. It's a
Not
conspiracy
endorsed
theory.
by I Wish You Were Alive, a podcast about things that used to be alive.
I wish you were dead.
I wish you were dead. Jeez, wow.
Yes,
Name my own podcast.
obviously, anti-Semitic, conspiracy theories are horrible, not endorsed here. But, like I said, it's a gateway drug because it seems, zany and fun and spontaneous. We're going to go run around and bang some sticks on some trees to call Bigfoot. It seems innocent in that way. But once the internet algorithms and things realize, oh, you like this kind of stuff, it will very quickly suck you into much more dangerous territory, which is the real tragedy of a lot of things. Because like I said, they can be fun if it's a kids cartoon show about cryptozoology. Hell yeah, I'm in, sign me up.
Right.
But
If you're watching National Treasure about, hidden maps and stuff, enjoy yourself, and
right.
I will watch those movies right along with you. But there's the hidden side of all of this.
Exactly. And so and a lot of people in cryptozoology circles are also in a lot of those more, insidious, more dangerous circles, and then they bring people from, the cryptozoology side into their other conspiracies. And
Right.
that's how conspiracies work. It's a never-ending rabbit hole. And on that happy note,
on that happy note, this has been episode 40 of I Wish You Were Alive. Jeez, I did it again. Oh, goodness.
Episode
the podcast
40,
is I Wish You
man.
Were Dead. Yeah, right. I think I've gotten it right every time until now. So I guess I'm
think
getting
so.
old. Yeah, I Wish You Were Dead podcast about things that used to be alive. Check the links in the description. That's Gavin. I'm Mike. Bye. See everybody next Wednesday.
Bye.